Okay. A very good afternoon to one and all present today. Thank you so much for joining our second event as a part of Inform's NCSU chapter 2021. So it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Stefan de Kok to give his experiences and share his knowledge on the areas which he was working for the last 20 years. So he is a chief executive of Vahupa and he is a management consultant. He worked in different kinds of companies and handled the profiles, including demand planning, forecasting, multi-echelon inventory optimization, sales and operations planning, and whatnot. Whatever comes under supply chain management, he is an expert and an industrial specialist in these areas. So today he is going to give a brief introduction about demand planning, and he is going to talk about different innovations that present in different aspects of the business in short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning. Is also going to highlight how these methods are going to give the effects of demand sensing, demand shaping, and demand collaborations in different business settings. So we have a second sequel for this particular presentation, which we planned in the month of March. Stefan is going to discuss more data-driven probabilistic and forecasting techniques and methods, including machine learning, so that will give more brief on the technical aspects, the math modeling and stuff. But today he's going to talk mostly on the planning side of it and what exactly this demand planning and forecasting really means in a business setting. I welcome Stefan. The stage is yours. So we will start our presentation and then we will have question and answers for 15 minutes. So with your permission, before we actually start, shall we have a group photograph? I request all the participants to please open your shutter. I mean, if you can, show your faces, we will have a group photograph that will be helpful for us to publish future events, and it will be a good motivation. Azu, I leave it to you. If you say and click OK, then we are fine.
Perhaps we kind of screen sharing.
I think people have already opened up. Yeah, some people are sitting inside the department, so they must need this face coverings. That's okay. But others, they can show their faces. We will have a group photograph.
I think perhaps the presenter need to have the screens sharing.
Oh, is the screen is not...
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah.
See what happens.
Oh, is it fine?
Go to gallery. And it should be everybody there. All right. 3, 2, 1, 0, smile. There we go. We have one person not turning on the camera, but that's fine. And let's have the arena leave to Stefan.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue.
Let me share again.
Please, please.
Okay, you can see my screen again?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I was delighted to be asked to speak. Mostly the topic for today was chosen to be, the state of the art and the innovations that are happening in the industry today. And maybe, I'm going to try and be a little bit forward-looking as well. So before I get into the meat of it, when we look at what's happening in the domain right now, we can see three major players, if you will. That's you guys in academia, that's me over in software and services, and then there's the industry that we all serve. So I do want to be completely open. I am in that red bubble, and so my perspective is that of someone who provides software and services. And I'm sure if we talk to people in one of the other bubbles, they might have a slightly different perspective. So the theory of innovation is really that there's this cycle where in the academia, we come up with all these great ideas, we test them, and the fruitful ones, they make it into the area where software vendors operate, where consultants operate, and they will then go and take it to the industry and apply it. And the requirements naturally come from the industry to drive where are we going to try and create new innovations. But reality is actually that there's very little innovation going on that's being shared in this cycle. And most of these areas are just spinning in circles within their own space. That doesn't mean that there's nothing happening. If you look at the interaction between the industry and the software and services, there's huge projects occurring and enormous amounts of cash being transferred from the industry to all those service and providers. But there's a big problem there. There's barely any innovation that's happening. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that those software vendors that are in the red bubble, they pay analysts. These analysts then advise the industry, and the industry then pays the vendors. So it's not really in the interest of the industry to recommend anything other than what brings in the most cash in this regard. And the bigger the player, the bigger their voice that they have. So in terms of the vendors, we're talking about the big ERP players like SAP and Oracle and Infor and Blue Yonder. It used to be JDA until last year. Those are paying the analyst, and there's some big guys there as well, the biggest one being Gartner. And basically, if you pay the most, you end up in their magic quadrant somewhere in a very nice spot. And companies in the industry will think, oh, you're really good. They're not really aware that you got in that spot because you contribute so much to these analysts, bottom line. And then there's another problem, in that there's these huge consulting firms like Capgemini and Accenture and KPMG, and you name all the big ones. They advise the industry, and then the industry hires them to implement those solutions that they've just recommended are the best ones that they should take. So it's in the interest of the consulting firms to suggest to implement solutions that are the biggest, the heaviest, because they get the most billable hours out of it. So if you have two solutions, and one is an SAP implementation that will keep 50 consultants occupied for 2 years, and the other one is a startup which will require 2 consultants for 3 months, and they achieve the same thing, the company is going to end up with the big one. And it's clear that that is not necessarily how you drive innovation. The other thing is there's this certification mechanism going on, certification institutes like APIX and CSCMP. And so both the industry and in the software and services space, they're sending their people to get certified. And these certifications are really, I call them resume fillers or CV fillers. It's just people that want to show that they can do a certain thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that all the material that they're learning is the stuff that's been promoted by the big guys, the big consulting firms, the big software vendors, and it's all the outdated concepts. So if you wanted to show that you understand the basics, that's perfect. That's what certifications are for. But if you're looking for innovation, they are the wrong place to go. There's a couple little guys out there that are actually more innovative, but they're just like in the software in the industry, they're more the exception than the rule. And then finally, academia is not off the hook as well. They're basically, kind of shielded, some firewall between academia and the rest of the commercial world, in that it's not really solving the problems. There's a lot of research going on, but it's not solving. And then generally, there's a couple of problems there. First, most academic research starts with some assumptions. For example, it's a pure distribution network, or it's a demand is normally distributed, or you name whatever is the assumptions that are being placed on research. And then ultimately you come up with some conclusions, but they cannot be implemented, but because real life doesn't follow those assumptions, right? And so you've basically found a solution to a problem that doesn't really exist in real life. Another issue is a lot of these solutions are not scalable. They really require the PhD to man the thing and tweak the buttons. And if you want to apply it in the commercial world, it needs to be hands-off. I like to say foolproof, because there's a tremendous amount of fools out there and not a lot of people that actually know what they're doing. So whatever solution you have, better be very forgiving in terms of, in its sensitivity to blow up and that kind of thing. And of course, it needs to be automatable. Right? If you've got a problem that you've solved in the academic space with 100 products and 3 locations, and now you go to the real world and they have 1 million products across 1,000 locations, suddenly, there's very limited stuff that you can do with people power, right? It has to be, there's a tremendous amount of automation that's required. So this was all true, I think, for enterprise software in general. So if we now focus on the subspace of that, which is demand planning, the root cause is really that back in the 1960s, these foundations of forecasting were developed and computing power was almost non-existent. And so they were forced to make these dramatic simplifications. Now, for aesthetics, I put this computer really an 80s computer. What the computers look like in those days is more like this. And what they're doing, right, those two guys, is they're actually looking at the source code. So the source code in these computers was being fed with paper strips with punch holes in them. And where the holes were, that determined what the code was that's going to be run. And this was really what it looked like at the time when demand forecasting and demand planning were first developed. And you can imagine, how limited you were in terms of things you could do. But then since then, these companies started and they grew and they became big, they became enormous, and they built these house of cards on these overly simplistic foundations. They're really too big to fail, if you will, and they're protecting themselves. So if you've got all these little innovative companies, they've got barely any budget, and they've got these huge ones that got $100 million of marketing cash available. They're going to protect, they're going to shout louder than anyone that their stuff is the best that there is. You don't need anything more. But in reality, their foundations are really, really bad. And I'll explain in more detail why that is. So maybe I gave you an indication that this is horrible and, why even bother going here? Well, reality is that in maybe last 10, 15 years, innovation actually started to speed up. We've had a half century where not much happened, where there were a couple of innovations in the 1970s. There was some interesting stuff in terms of S&OP, collaborative forecasting in the late 80s and in the 90s, but over a 50-year time span, there's not much to show for it. But now in the recent decade and a half, things really started to speed up. And I've been a witness to all of that, and I've considered it that there was a reckoning happening, that there was just enough force that of parties out there that said this is not acceptable. And if you compare forecasting to other domains, and a lot of domains, if you say how good or how accurate or are you, a lot of them talk in terms of number of nines. So if you have 99.9% uptime, that's 3 nines. If you have 99.9999, that's 6 nines. You compare that to forecasting, 65% accuracy. Almost all companies that you'll talk to that forecast would be delighted if they could make a 65% accuracy, right? We're not in the same ballpark as where a lot of the other domains are. And that is not from any lack of trying. In all these decades, more than half a century, enormous amounts of efforts and research has gone into squeezing out, the fraction of percentages of greater accuracy in these forecasts. But, they were primarily focused on how to forecast. But they were unwilling to really change that. So one of the things is they needed to go back to the basics. What are you actually forecasting, right? And they never question that. But the moment you change what you forecast, you're going to have to tear down your whole house of cards and start afresh. So if you've got 10,000 customers live on a product, throwing that out and starting from scratch is not a viable option. So all the parties that already have these softwares built on this, they do not want to go here, right? And it is in their best interest to make sure that nobody else gets out ahead of them. And that's why all this stifling of the innovation. But even more importantly is, what do you measure, right? So if you don't measure correctly, you don't know what you're going to have to fix. So these 3 parts is what I'm going to be talking about for the most part of the rest of this session. Okay, so what was this reckoning that we're talking about? So on one side, there's been, even from the very beginning, there's been this discussion of granularity. I can forecast by product family globally in a monthly granularity pretty easily. Patterns are going to be very smooth. I can draw a curve through it. It's pretty easy. However, if I want to drive my business, I need to be able to execute on it. And if I need to know what I'm going to stock of a particular item, a particular SKU, stock keeping unit, I need to go at a finer granularity than a product family. I need to go to the product. If I want to act on that in time, I need to go to a finer time granularity than months. I might go to weeks or days. And now it gets even worse. In these days, the Amazon effect, where we need to be able to supply the product next day or within a few days, instead of having one central factory in the world, or maybe one per continent that we ship from, we now need to have all these distribution centers all around the world that are closer to the customer. And each of those will have a much more fragmented demand pattern, which is much harder to forecast. So the more granular you get, the more intermittent the demand get. And of course, companies are proliferating their portfolio. So many more products. Before, you could get one Ford, T model. Now you can get all these different models of cars and all these different options. And if the manufacturer needs to have them ready, they need to know how many are going to be in green with the GPS, with the DVD system, with the leather seats, you name it. So, and in every market, that's been pretty much the same. So it's getting harder and harder. Now, on the other end of that tug of war rope is causality. So certain things we can figure out just from a typical forecast algorithm. Will know things such as trend or seasonality. But now you got things going on like promotions, or maybe a competitor is doing something, or even secondary effects. If you promote one item, some other items will also see an increase. If you're promoting Coca-Cola in cans, you might also see that there's going to be an increase of other Coca-Cola products. Or if you're promoting a certain model of a phone, the cases for that model of the phone will also see an increase. On the other hand, you will also see cannibalization. So by selling more of one product, you'll sell less of other products. So all these kinds of forms of causality are making it really difficult. And what you get is competing algorithms. So if you look at any commercial forecasting engine on the market, they'll have anywhere from 20 to 30. I know of one that has more than 200 different algorithms. And one algorithm is really good if you've got seasonality or trends, and another one is really good if you've got promotional effects. But they're both weak in where the other is weak. So now you got to pick which algorithm do I pick. But if you have a strongly seasonal product that's also promoted, now you got a problem, because neither of your algorithms is the best one in both cases. And this is a struggle that's been going on already from the 1970s. But there's a third party pulling on that rope in a completely different direction. And that is, there's also the matter of uncertainty. We all know that the future is uncertain, but all the forecasts that we've been creating are pretending that we do not. So there's a little bit of lip service there. We calculate a residual error, and maybe we use it to determine a safety stock for inventory, and then we pretend that's where uncertainty ends. But that's not where uncertainty ends. If you're going to now say next month we're going to sell 100 units of this item, and we're going to put it in our plan, and then in reality it becomes 150, it's not just going to be a disruption on your inventory. It's going to be a disruption on your manufacturing. It's going to be a disruption on your raw material supply. The uncertainty that is inherent in a demand doesn't just stop at inventory. Now, this problem with the competing algorithms, that one's not going away. But when we throw uncertainty in the mix, and a number of the assumptions that are part of the traditional algorithms are no longer valid, if they ever were. But they're less valid by the day as these supply chains get more global. The big one being that the assumption that you can use a normal distribution to describe your demand and supply patterns utterly breaks down. If you're looking at a product family by month globally, yes, it's going to look pretty much like a normal distribution. But if you're going to look at a size extra small shoe of a certain brand in a certain store or in a certain remote area, it's going to be almost all zero demand, and then suddenly you'll get a blip, especially if you're going to determine on a weekly basis what you need to have in any given store or warehouse. No, it's going to be an extremely skewed distribution. And as a consequence, all your easy formulas that you have based on the assumption that everything is nicely normally distributed end up being horribly wrong. And then there's the third part of this, and that is all these causal factors make it really hard to distinguish what is signal and what is noise. And I will be speaking quite a bit on that latter part, on the signal and the noise. But if we think back 2 slides ago about the how to forecast, yes, we've got that covered. What to forecast, that is what I'm going to talk about next. And then finally, at the end, is the what to measure is also very important, because that closes the loop and allows us to identify the real problems that we have. We can fix what we forecast, we can fix how we forecast, and we measure and keep looping that way. So before I go there, I did want to quickly make sure everyone is on the same page of what uncertainty is. You'll hear words like variability, volatility, and uncertainty used interchangeably all over the place, but they're not the same thing. So variability is really the differences in that you might have in any particular time period for any particular product on its demand or supply patterns. Volatility, I like to see more as the a change in variability. So if you think of what my demand as being location and your variability as velocity, then volatility is your acceleration, right? It's how does your variability change? And in today's market, you know, that volatility is one of the things that has gotten you know, a lot worse. And then you have the typical things that you'll find in the industry, such as complexity and ambiguity. And they all give us the information that we need to plan, forecast, plan, and execute. And part of that is knowledge. We can find some patterns in there, and we can consider that the knowledge, the things that we know for sure. And what's left, the part that we don't know, that's really the uncertainty. So variability says something about your demand. Uncertainty says, what part of that do we not know? Right, so that's a big distinction between the two. Okay, so the status quo, where's the industry right now? And I've mentioned that in the last 10, 15 years, there's all these kind of innovations happening. I'd say 90 to 95% of the industry hasn't gone there yet, right? The vast majority of the industry are so-called laggards. They want to see others succeed or fail before they decide whether they're going to go into and try the same concepts as well. I'm going to build
a quick question.
Yeah.
A quick question. May I ask now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, could you just go back to your previous two slides? I mean that volatility, variability, here. Are you saying that these, variability, volatility are all independent that leads to uncertainty, or they themselves are, connected together, like more variability leads to volatility, and volatility and variability results in complexity. So what are we going to take away from this particular slide?
The takeaway here is that I want to make sure that when I speak of uncertainty, that everyone recognizes that it's not any of these other parts. Uncertainty is the part of all of this that we can't quantify properly yet, that we don't know exactly. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So the knowledge is the general trends, the general patterns, and the uncertainty is all that fluff around it that we can't properly capture, if you will.
Okay, thanks.
So I was asked to show how demand planning, how all the different parts fit together. So I call this typical, but I want to make it clear that there's no such thing as typical. Like every company will do this slightly different. So before I go into that, I want to be clear, there will be many examples where it doesn't quite follow like this. Some companies will have fewer blocks, some will have more blocks, and some will have the arrows that are connecting them somewhat different. But now I'd say 80 to 90% will follow something very, very similar to this. So we start with the statistical forecast. That's usually, if you think about demand planning in the industry, it's usually on some kind of cycle, often a monthly cycle. Every month we try and predict going forward what our forecast is, and with all the new information that we got in the last month. Some businesses are on weekly, some are daily, some are quarterly, and some do a bit of all of them. There will be daily cycles, weekly cycles, monthly cycles, quarterly cycles. And the bigger the company, the more likely you're going to see all of those cycles happening. But it all starts with a statistical forecast, which is mostly automatically generated, and it's typically expressed in volume, so units or cases, and it then can be aggregated. So we can make a forecast by SKU, by sales territory, and then we can sum it up and see what's my total for a product family, or by a customer account, or by a region, or even group it together and say what's the total demand that this factory needs to supply with product. And it gets aggregated to the financial level. And at the financial level, we could compare it to a budget. And the budget is typically created once a year. Annual operating plans are typically created once a year. And the problem here is that the budget, will then be compared to the financial forecast, but typically after the fact. And it's all done on Excel. So whereas your statistical forecast is usually a commercial system that is run automatically on some kind of schedule every period, the budget it usually takes, it's usually a 3-month effort, and it includes the CFO, the CEO, the various people in the financial department to come up with a budget, and a lot of departments within the company haggling to get a bigger portion of the budget. And so it's a long, arduous process, and it's mostly offline on spreadsheets. And in recognition that the statistical forecast is often or usually wrong, most people will say the forecast is always wrong. Many companies have realized that we need to augment and adjust that forecast with input from the sales team. And they say, well, I know for a fact that this account is going to run a promotion, or they're going to open 10 more doors, as they call it, 10 more stores or what have you. So their demand is going up, and they make adjustments to the statistical forecast that the engine didn't know. And the whole idea being that should improve the accuracy, and it will drive better plans as a consequence. And a big input to that sales forecast is generally the budget. So sales knows exactly what they're supposed to be selling for the year. So they're going to try and align their sales forecast with the budget. A big problem here is that this is another one of these manual processes, and the salespeople rather would be out selling, and instead they're in tweaking the forecast. And they're not statisticians. They don't like to do that stuff, and it's going to take time away from them hitting their quota. So it's not a process that most people that are involved in it actually like to do. And then there's this thing called sales and operations planning. Usually has a 2-level approach with a tactical team creating an initial sales and operations plan, and then it's summed up into often a quarterly, sometimes a monthly executive SNOP, where maybe even the C-level of the company can have a driving input into that meeting. And the objective of the sales and operations plan is to identify differences between what we predict demand will be and what we can supply, and try and resolve that conflict. So if we're short of an item, we're going to maybe cancel a promotion. If we're overstocked on an item, maybe we should promote that item. Or maybe we should tell the sales people to, don't push us hard selling this item, because we're going to go and get into some trouble supplying it if you are successful selling that particular item. The output of which is generally referred to as a consensus plan. Everyone agreed that this is the plan that we're going to run the business according to. And here we get into some demand shaping. So demand shaping really is active activities to change demand. For the most part, all I've discussed so far is what do we think demand will be given all that we can do? And then how do we need to constrain that demand based on what we can actually do with our supply chain? But in demand shaping, this is where we're actually trying to change demand to make it go somewhere else. And that could include trade promotions, but it could also include new product introductions. We're going to introduce a new gold with white specs version of this product because we think it's going to sell more than the other colors, and whatever goes into it will mostly be the same. Or we're going to provide a bigger one with 25% more content, a nice colorful band on it to say that this is the bigger and better, just to drive up demand. One big problem, of course, in demand shaping is it creates an enormous amount of noise. So if you're trying to predict your forecast, your demand in the future based on what happened historically, the moment you start promoting it, shaping it, you're changing it, and it deteriorates the quality of your forecast. And any deterioration in quality of your forecast will trickle down through the supply chain. It will make your inventory to service trade-off worse. It will cause disruptions for your suppliers. They might end up supplying you late. So while demand shaping is generally a good thing, it also has a downside to it. Ultimately, out of all of that, we need to operationalize it. We've been talking on customer count by product family level, and we need to take it down a notch, finer detail, so that we know what to stock in specific warehouses, what specific plans we'll need to produce of individual product. So we need to make it fine. Now, what happens here is it's usually an automated process where the high-level quantities are split into finer detail, and using often some clever logic to come up with what those finer details must be. And it's usually an automated process. And now, before we can hand that over to the business, we need to figure out all the discrepancies between the orders that have already come in and the forecast. So let's say we forecast that every month we're going to do 100 units of a certain item, but now we've already got, we're halfway through the month, and we've already got orders for 150. Definitely the 100 is wrong, right? So what most companies do is they'll say, okay, we'll take the larger of the forecast and the orders. That's our forecast consumption. But really, you've got a whole chunk of month left. You probably should adjust that even more. Or maybe you're near the end of the month and you've only sold 5. Are you really still going to achieve 100? Right? So that works both ways. And the simple logic of just taking the maximum of the two will end up introducing a positive or a negative bias, right? The forecast being higher than your actuals consistently. So your forecast is not just wrong, it's off target. And ultimately that gets down into, it's going to be used in all your downstream planning processes. So what I've shown here is a number of the key processes just on the demand side. If you think, that's quite a lot. On the operations side, there's many, many more boxes than even here. So to run a business and translating all these processes, all these patterns, and making sure that you drive your business the best, it's a very large problem to solve. Everyone runs on a different cycle or at a different stage in their cycle. It's a nightmare to align and synchronize all of it. And then finally, I promised I'd talk a little bit about demand sensing. So demand sensing, there's a lot of confusion about it, and I think that's mostly due to marketing. In its essence, demand sensing is nothing more than grabbing your demand signal further downstream. So if I'm a Kellogg's and I make cornflakes, my customer might be a Walmart, right? A forecast will say how much cornflakes are we selling from our Kellogg's warehouses. Demand sensing will say, well, no, how much is Walmart moving out of their warehouses, cornflakes, or take it even further downstream, how much are customers buying individual cash register scans, so-called point of sale demand sensing. So we're going downstream. The data starts getting way bigger, but it's also way finer. So what we gain is we get the signal earlier. So if Walmart sells a lot of cornflakes at the cash register, it doesn't translate to a new replenishment order to Kellogg's until probably 2 weeks later, because the front of the store is going to be replenished by the back of the store warehouse. The back of the store warehouse is going to be replenished by a Walmart distribution center. And each of them has their own levels of inventory. Multiple streams of demand from many stores are going to come together. And based on what their inventory position is, at some point, they're finally going to give a big order to Kellogg's to say, resupply this distribution center. So what we gain by using demand sensing is we get that latency. And that can be anywhere from a week to 4 weeks, is how much more notice we get that demand is going to be coming. And that's really the benefit of demand sensing. Now, what has happened is now you've got these commercial systems that then use the sensed demand and create a forecast based on that. And they sell it as demand sensing. I call that more like demand sensing plus. The sensing part is really capturing that demand sooner and finer. That you can forecast it is true, but it's still forecasting. It's just forecasting on a different demand stream. What makes it really tough is that not every customer will share their information with you. So now you're going to have to merge multiple streams of demand. Some of them you won't know until you get the sales order from your customer. Some of them, they'll give you a forecast, and often those forecasts are horribly wrong, and you could do a better job just forecasting it yourself. And some of them will give you their sensed demand. And they're all going to be at different stages in the supply chain network. So you're going to have to translate those through lead times to determine how they all come together. Okay.
Question?
Yeah.
Stefan, this process is interesting to follow, but this question is gripping my mind. We have forecast coming from finance team from the budget, and then we have demand forecasting, statistical forecasting from the forecasting team, and with the collaborative manual work, we do the executive sales and operations planning. But this demand shaping and demand sensing is definitely going to distort our forecast, whatever we work out during this particular process. So if this is the case, why we need to go through this process unnecessarily? Rather, we can take directly something from the field and then go directly with some implementation. Definitely forecast is going to be with bias and error. So our objective is to minimize that, and taking inputs directly from the market will solve the problem easily, isn't it? So could you just throw some light on it?
Yeah, so the problem is we have various time horizons that we need to plan for. So the sense demand will only help us for the next couple of weeks. But if we need to supply raw materials from China to the US, that's generally a 3-month lead time. So we can't use the sense demand for that. Also, what I just mentioned, that sense demand is probably only a small portion of your total demand. So you still need something for the mom and pop shops that don't store their cash register scans on a daily basis and share it with you. Also, if you look at a Walmart, a Target, a Walgreens, a Kroger, they all have different demand sensing systems. They all have their data structured differently. All of that needs to be, when you combine it, you need to have quite a lot of IT overhead to be able to process all of that and normalize it, and then translate it into something that is in the same time frame, at the same echelon in your network as all the other demand streams you're getting. So yeah, and then demand shaping typically happens 6 to 8 weeks into the future. And so, yeah, that goes into your tactical horizon, but it still doesn't allow you, if you want to make a plan. So if you're in fashion, you know that you're going to have a huge spike of demand for bikinis in the summer. You'll sell nothing in the winter, but you need to order the raw materials. You need to spin the fabrics, you need to dye it, you need to cut it and assemble it well before that season starts, and you need to reserve all that capacity. Right, so you do need forecasts that go 18 months, 2 years out in order to properly plan ahead and not be purely reactive.
Yeah, the reason for asking this again is like every company have this particular demand planning module, right? Let it be Walmart or let it be, Kellogg's, who is going to supply to Walmart. And everyone has their budgets, their S&OP process, demand shaping, sensing. Let it be the upstream processes of a typical like a bikini supply chain or a Coca-Cola drink supply chain. Every company in a business is doing this particular process. So if one makes a change, that is going to impact the other one in the supply chain,
Yes.
ultimately the product before it reaches the end user. Now, the question is, we are already dealing with forecast, and which is not always right. And then we are doing additional components of demand shaping and sensing. And there are multiple players in a typical supply chain before the product reaches a customer. Where are we heading to? I mean, every business has to do somewhere or the other to run their businesses, right? So what is that key thing they have to do to avoid, the distortion, which you said, noise, error, bias, whatever it is?
Well, there's a couple of things, and I'll discuss some of them. But if you really want to minimize that noise, you need a close collaborative relationship with your customers and with your suppliers, right? You need to ensure that as a manufacturer, I'm aware of what Walmart is planning with regards to my product. If as a manufacturer, I'm going to have a problem supplying, maybe my main factory is in China and it's going to be Chinese New Year, right? The products that I make in that factory, we probably better stock up on them before the Chinese New Year, because there's going to be a month where we're not producing any of it, right? So there's, and at that level, I think most companies already collaborate that kind of information, but it permeates at every level of detail, and there's still, it's not always in your best interest to show your cards to your customer, because you're still negotiating on price and on terms. And the moment you show everything, they've got a stronger negotiating position and you're going to lose, right? So it's, there's always a conflict, but yeah, it's not a problem that is easy to solve. But, and we'll get to the probabilistic part, if all you could do is at least quantify your uncertainty and plan accordingly, and if you see that there's areas where that uncertainty is dramatically large, well, that's where you should focus on, maybe finding out if there's information you can share or information you can share sooner to reduce that uncertainty and make, as a supplier, be more efficient in supplying your customer. The flip side of this is what's called the bullwhip effect. So
yes,
this is a really
I don't
big
want
problem.
to mention it. You said that.
So yeah, the bullwhip effect is where small fluctuations of demand, as they trickle upstream through the supply chain, they amplify. And it becomes increasingly harder for suppliers and suppliers of suppliers and their suppliers to predict what's going to happen because of that effect.
Yeah, we just witnessed that during this COVID situation, right? Especially this toilet paper. Oh my God, just 5-6 months, it was completely lost. All these shelves were lost. I mean, we can sense that, right? It's exactly what we are talking. Thanks for giving this.
There's a lot of things that you could prepare for. If you were a toilet paper manufacturer, that was not one of them. Right? I would not expect that anyone would be, going to the toilet more or dramatically more because, a virus is there. Yeah, maybe there's some symptoms that would require a little bit more, but not to the point where you have to stock up, a whole room full of toilet paper. So what's the problem in this whole picture? I'm going to continue further on. So you already mentioned the bias. Well, that's definitely one. So the sales forecast, they have to meet their budget. So that budget is going to change what they say they're going to do, because they don't want to show a gap to the budget. Imagine you're a sales rep and you've got a quota to make. Even if you know you're not going to meet your quota, and at the end of year, there's probably going to be a reckoning and you might lose your job, you don't want to start telling that 6 months ahead of time that you're not going to hit your quota and lose your job early. You're just going to make it sound like everything is just fine and you're going to be, you're going to make your target, even if you know you don't. So there's an incentive to bias the sales forecast, and it's almost always up. And this is why a lot of companies have obsolete stock, is because they stocked way too much. On the other hand, let's assume that if you're in the supply chain and your sales guy says, yeah, we're going to sell 10,000 units of that. And you can already feel we're never going to make 10,000. But if you said, you know what, I'm going to only stock 5,000. And then through some incredible pushing or luck, the sales guy actually sold 10,000, it's going to reflect really poorly on you. That you didn't have, he told you it was going to be 10,000, and why did you only make 5,000, right? And now the customer is not happy. On the other hand, and that's way more common, they said 10,000 and it was indeed 5,000, and now they're stuck with 5,000 in inventory, but they're stuck with 5,000 of inventory of every product there is. So their inventory is going through the roof. So as a demand planner, you can never win. If you're right, someone takes the credit for it. If you're wrong, someone blames you for it. And part of that is that bias. Now, another big problem is that there's no arrow typically going from your automatic financial forecast into your offline budget. So the budget is pure wishful thinking. And that wishful thinking is what's driving the bias down into your sales forecast. There is no closed loop there from almost all companies. That loop is not closed. And then the statistical forecast inherently has a large error in it. So that error is actually what's driving the sales adjustment, the collaborative input to be an intensive exercise. Because if all of your forecast is 50% off, they need to touch everything to try and correct for it. So that makes that whole process incredibly frustrating and cumbersome for the people involved. And then finally, that demand shaping, there's usually no feedback loop from that one to tell the statistical forecast what it needs to change. So at best, what you're going to see is the sales guys or the promotions team, they're going to say, no, you forecast 100, we're going to do a major promotion, or I've got a negotiation with the customer. It's not going to be 100, it's going to be 1,000, right? That's all the engine ever knows. It wasn't 100, it's 1,000. It never knows what the reason was. And looking back in time, it never knows that the 100 was wrong. It only saw, whoa, my actual was really high. My number was, my forecast was really low. So my variability is off the chart, right? So the engine gets anemic. It doesn't learn. So it keeps this consistent state where it's going to feed bad forecasts into sales forecasts. And that requires them to keep on this heavy manual process to second guess the forecast. And then a huge error occurs in the forecast consumption. So if we think about the near term, we know all the orders that are going to happen. The far term, it needs to be your forecast, but somewhere in the middle, we've got this gray area where some orders are known. And this is where forecast consumption gets into deep trouble. And the error is usually much bigger than the original forecast. And if we take some very typical numbers, I've seen benchmarks that are all hovering around the same numbers. If we start with a statistical forecast that has a 50% error, once the sales forecast spends enormous energy to improve it, they might shave off a little bit of that error. But the moment it gets split down, it introduces a huge error. And then once it's consumed, there's an 85% error. And operations has to deal with a forecast that's 85% wrong on average, right? It's really difficult. But what happens, well, we aggregate that statistical forecast compared to our budget, and at that level, we only had a 10% error. So the sales team and the demand planners, they tap themselves on the back and say, wow, we did a great job. We had 90% accuracy. 10% error, and we're all going to make our bonus, right? And in the meanwhile, the business is struggling because where it mattered, they had a horrible error. They had a great accuracy where it didn't matter. They had a horrible accuracy where it did matter. And so that's a huge problem in this kind of approach. And that brings us to current. I don't know if you wanted to have a quick question about this before I go into the current innovations, or if this was pretty much clear.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Who has the responsibility to do the demand shaping and sensing? I mean, does the forecast team do it, or there are additional people who have additional skills?
There's usually an account team, and account means customer, right? So if you're a Kellogg's, you'll have a Walmart account team, you'll have a Target account team, you'll have a CVS account team. All the big major accounts will have their own team, and they negotiate. So for Walmart to have a promotion on cornflakes, they need to agree on a lot of things, and Walmart needs to reserve some special promotional shelving for it that's not available for other suppliers. Right? Maybe Coca-Cola also wanted to have a promotion, but now that space at the front of the shelf is now taken up by cornflakes. Right? So it's a negotiation process. How much discount do they get? How much volume are they going to take? What happens if they are stuck with a lot of product in the end? Do they ship it back? Do they get their money back? You know what? Ultimately, whatever they negotiate at, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be the discount. This is going to be, there's going to be a hostess in the store that lets you sample. There's going to be a brochure. There's going to be an ad, whatever it may be. That is done by the TPM, is usually the trade promotion management team per account. And then they should tell the forecasting team, hey, we've settled on this promotion in 7 weeks from now. Okay, so now adjust your forecast to accommodate the fact that you now know that we're running this promotion with those parameters. That feedback never happens. Okay. Okay, I'll continue with current innovations. So the focus today and in the past has all been on this statistical forecast. And statistical forecasts have one great strength, which is really good in finding patterns in time series. So if you have a lot of history, and especially if that pattern is relatively smooth, it can project going forward how that pattern will continue. But it has a couple of weaknesses. One is it looks at one time series at a time. So if you're forecasting by product, by account, it will look at that product, at that account, and it doesn't compare that to that same product for another account, or for another product at the same account. So it's not able to find any patterns across data. And it is not good at including causal factors. You either have seasonality or you have causal factors. You don't really have many algorithms that are good at both. There's the ARIMA, REMAX types algorithms that do both, but they're not really good at it. And of course, it ignores uncertainty, and the big monster of statistical forecast is overfitting. So overfitting, that's the biggest issue overall of statistical forecast, is you could fit a curve through all your historical data that fits it perfectly, but it will have zero predictive value. Right? If I have 20 historical data points, I could have a polynomial of order 19 and I fit it exactly through every point exactly, but it will go completely off the charts when I extrapolate that in the future. On the flip side, if you just draw a straight line through it, you're probably not, you're definitely not overfitting, but you're going to lose the ability to include things like seasonality and trends. And so somewhere in between, you got to find something that doesn't overfit, but is still accurate enough. And statistical forecasting after 80 years still hasn't figured out how to get properly over that. So the other focus today is on that collaborative part. So we're going to second guess the statistical forecast, and we're going to add intelligence to it to improve it. Now, if we look at where the innovation today is happening, there is a small, well, actually, it's a large group of people doing it, of companies doing it, but there's a very small portion of people that are doing innovations in that area. And that is, we're going to double down on the statistical forecast. And if you've heard a concept like a range forecast, you'll find that in that area. It's really a statistical forecast, but assuming that there's a normal distribution and our fitted error is this much, we have a standard deviation, we can say, okay, if you want a 95% confidence range, it's going to be, 2 sigma below and 2 sigma above the forecast. That's your confidence range. So those are the range forecasts that you're going to get. And of course, all the same weaknesses and strength as the statistical. On the other end are these demand-driven concepts that have become pretty much a hype in the last 10 years. And what they started off completely denying that forecasts were a thing, right? They said, you got to get rid of forecasts completely. Now they've, over many years, many iterations, they're now down to, okay, you need it for strategic planning, long-term, midterm, tactical, but you really don't want it for operational level, which is more fine granularity and short term. And they basically gave up on the forecast altogether. Now, its strength is, it found a way to reduce the uncertainty in the near term to, and for some time range, just reduce it down to 0. And so you don't have to buffer anything if your uncertainty is 0, right? So it is perfect for a very small portion of the situations that you can achieve, but it helps you nothing at all for all the other stuff. And another major area, and this is another one of those things that is a reoccurrence or revival, if you will, of something that was popular in the 80s, artificial intelligence. It kind of died a slow death and then was almost dead. And now suddenly it's, in the last 10 years, it's become a major thing again. So now we're going to try and use artificial intelligence to get a better forecast. Now, it is amazing with causal factors. Like if you have a linear regression, it's going to be able to take into account a couple of different causal factors. If you've got a machine learning, you could take 1,000 or 2,000 different aspects or attributes, product attributes, market attributes, promotion attributes, and it will find which ones are significant, right? So, it will find the patterns across data. So it will say, you're introducing a new product right now. There's a similar product that you introduced last year, so this one's going to behave somewhat like it. Its weakness is time series. They're really bad with time series. And still very few of the artificial intelligence approaches consider uncertainty. And they're still very much prone to overfitting. And my baby, the last tier of innovation is probabilistic forecasting. So I'll speak some more about that. And again, disclaimer, this is where I focus my attention. So of course, I'm going to speak well of it. And this is where we basically say, look, there's nothing wrong with forecasting per se, which is the premise of demand-driven. It's how and what we forecast that needs to be rethought. And what it does, it basically focuses on the uncertainty and says, we're going to try and quantify that. It can still do really well with individual time series. It can do well with causal factors, and it has a proper answer for forecast consumption, which I have a slide on. But like a statistical one, it's not really that great. Better, but still not great at finding patterns across data. So where do I think we're going to be going in the future? Well, we need to combine these three. Each of them has complementary strength, and they work well together. Statistical forecast and demand-driven are like oil and water. They don't go together. You really have to choose one or the other to do anything. But probabilistic forecasting and demand-driven go really well. as do artificial intelligence and probabilistic forecasting. You think about an exponential smoothing statistical forecasting algorithm. If you have double or triple exponential smoothing, including trends and seasonalities, there's no place where you can introduce in the middle something that you've learned with machine learning. It doesn't allow for that. So you can only apply a factor after the fact. Probabilistic forecasting, on the other hand, allows you at any point in the process to interject additional information. So it's a much nicer fit with that. And then I think there's still a role for collaborative planning to add extra information, but there's got to be some rules as to how you provide that information so the engine can learn. So it doesn't become anemic, right? And it should go way down. So I've implemented statistical, or sorry, yeah, implement statistical as well. I implemented probabilistic forecasting, and I've been part of a company that has implemented it in hundreds of companies. And the collaborative part goes way down. So you have salespeople that are changing 300 time series every month, and they end up doing 1 or 2 a month. So it goes way down to almost 0. And the reason being that the probabilistic forecast already considers a lot of the uncertainty. And only when you're outside of the normal realm of your uncertainty, a true extreme outlier, that's when you tell the system, hey, you gotta cover for something that's beyond what you're already covering for. Okay, so I've got one slide each on those 4 buckets. So very quickly, how does statistical forecasting work? You basically either have a traditional one at the top, or you have a bottom one where you see the confidence ranges added to it. The green is history and the red is future, and the red and the blue is future. So how does it work? First, you create many forecasts, anywhere between 20 and 30 is the norm. And for each of them, you fit a curve through the historical values. You determine what the error is in history. And then you extrapolate that curve in the future. Then you go and say, well, which one of these 20 or 30 curves is the best one? And what you're going to do with that is they determine some kind of information criteria. Common ones are the Bayesian information criteria, BIC, and the Ikaike information criteria, the AIC. And their purpose is to determine the smoothness of the curve. Because if it's not smooth, you're probably overfitting. If it's smooth, you're probably not overfitting. And then it's trying to find the best balance between the error and the smoothness penalty to come up with which one's the best one. And then if you've picked the best one, then later you can determine those confidence ranges around it. But here, this is very common, by the way, the one you see at the left, this is one from Forecast Pro, commercial system out there. The premise of a statistical forecast is that your error is normally distributed, identically and independently normally distributed, which means the band around your forecast is the same everywhere across all time, because it's got the same distribution everywhere. The problem now is if you've got peaks and valleys, at those valleys, your lower bound is going to be negative, which is a real problem. So instead, what most forecasting systems do, they say, no, we're going to scale it with the forecast. So when there's a peak, my range between the confidence goes up, and when it's low, the range narrows down. And that way, as a percentage, and that way we can guarantee it doesn't go negative. But now you've got a mathematical conundrum in that your first assumption was it was uniform. And then in step 2, you assume it's not uniform. And so it's theoretically flawed. It's conceptually flawed. But other than that, there's a couple of problems with it. First of all, every forecast has a strength. Every forecast has a weakness. You have to choose between seasonality or causal. But when we look at historical values, periodic, we lose signal. So in the early days, they found out, yeah, we need to group all that demand data, and we are going to group it by month and by country and by family, because now it becomes smooth and we don't have much computing power. So, we don't have to compute it much. And what they found is, you lose a lot of noise when you aggregate. But they didn't realize you lose a lot of signal. So that loss, you lose signal in almost equal measures as you lose noise. So there's patterns in the detail that you will never find in the high level. In fact, you might find a completely different pattern, different opposing trends. There's this thing called the Simpson's paradox, or the Simpson-Yule paradox, which explains that really with some very clear examples on Wikipedia that you can see. Whatever you aggregate could be a really a bad representation. The other thing is the fitted error is a severe underestimation. Professor in England's Chatfield, because Chatfield at one point calculated that based benchmarking, and most companies have between a factor 2 to 3 underestimation of the error. And they're using that error to then determine how much safety stock to buffer for. So that trickles down into why they have really bad service levels. And extrapolating a curve into the future, well, that assumes that history repeats itself. Well, history doesn't purely repeat itself. All these causal factors, all these shaping factors, they might repeat to some degree, but they're going to be completely different in future than they were in history. Finally, determine that those criteria, you look at them, you can't determine a unit of measure for them because they're a weird, trial and error based metric that they came up with. And then they're going to find a balance between this arbitrary metric and your error. And we're going to find some trade-off. You're choosing to have a lower or a higher error than the best one because you're trying to combat this other overfitting monster. So there's a maximum accuracy that you can achieve purely based off of that. You're targeting a worse than the best error, or a worse than the best accuracy that you can get. And of course, those confidence ranges, which I mentioned before, they're not normal, they're not stationary. So pretty much at every step of the process of a statistical forecast is flawed. I have no other way than to say they're fundamentally flawed. To just give you an indication of how that uncertainty unfolds, if you look at these two weekly patterns, in terms of periodic quantity, they're identical. But if you look at how many orders, customer orders, make up that quantity, the top one has many small orders and the bottom one has a few large ones. So the uncertainty is different between the two. If you miss a small order out of many, it doesn't affect you much. If you miss one big order out of a few, it impacts you dramatically. And not only does your uncertainty, the height of those blue bars change, also the level might change. And if you're doing a statistical forecast based just on the quantity, you have no way of knowing which one is which. So you're basically steering a ship with a rudder that's attached to the till with an elastic band. You can have a little bit of control, but you really are not controlling your ship the way you think you are. And all of your cycle stock, your safety stock are dependent on those two. And all of your downstream planning processes are depending on those two. So if you feed the wrong information to your other planning processes, they're all going to be wrong. Okay. And this is just one. I just gave one example of where using just a period quantity is wrong, but there's many examples like it that will deteriorate. I'm going to go a little faster. I might speed up because we've got 15 minutes left. So just to compare that to probabilistic forecasting, basically you're going to decompose all your historic demand into many parts. For each of them, you're now going to determine what does that take away from the noise and what does it add to the signal. And then finally, in the future, you're going to recompose the future by adding them all together. Okay. And important to realize here is that both noise, which is the blue flat line shaded area, as well as the signal, which is the fluctuating gradient area, are their own probability distributions. They are not single numbers. They're not like standard deviation or mean. They're really entire distributions, all of their own. The problem here is that, in order to determine that, do we have enough data? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And compounding the distributions in the end to come up with your forecast is anything but easy, right? And that's where the research needs to go. I've figured out a way to do it, and I'm pretty sure it's not the only way. It's probably not even the best way.
I have a question. So here in what you're showing is essentially that you have like ambiguity on the distributions. Like all of these are probability distributions, and you have like some sort of range on each. Yeah. Support, point of the support. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I've indicated that as gradients because I got to visualize it some way, as opposed to just putting two hard bounds, because it's really there's really a curve. It's not the bell shape. It's some other curve. Yeah. That's behind it, and you have a higher probability to be near the darker shades and a lower probability to be at a night near the lighter shades. But every causal effect will have its own distribution. So if I have a promotion, it has a certain distribution. If I have seasonality, it has a distribution. So for every time period.
You make no assumption on the distribution, and you just use the empirical points and try to have like this all the distributions to consider all possible, right? Something like
that. There are many schools of thought on that. And if you look at a company like Locat in Paris, they are completely on the empirical path. I make some assumption in my former employer, Tools Group. They're the third between Wahupa, Tools Group, and Locat. They're really the three commercial software in probabilistic forecasting out there. Tools Group has been doing this since 1978. So I call it an innovation, but it's been, they've been secretive about it, like Coca-Cola about the recipe. So it's been the world's best guarded secret for all that time. But Tools Group and Wahupa do it closed form. So we make some assumption about the distribution, but it's not a very narrow, right? If you think about something like a Tweedy distribution, it's a whole family of distributions that can cover almost any pattern, right? But you have to find a distribution that covers the typical patterns that you find in the domain that you cover, but is still tractable. And Tweedy is not really that tractable.
Okay, that makes total sense. Okay, thank you.
But it scales. Like Locat has a problem. If you're in forecasting, you can run simulations. Sure, to do 1,000 simulations, it takes you 1,000 times longer. So if you want to make the same forecast in the same amount of time, you need 1,000 times as much computing capabilities. But now if you're planning and it's simulation based, it explodes. Whereas if you're closed form, you can still do it in the same time amount. It scales. So on artificial, we're running really short on time. I just want to mention that there's three typical buckets in which you can apply artificial intelligence here. Clustering, regression, and classification, which basically is find items that are similar to one another, quantify their effect within each of their clusters, and classification, if you have an item that you want to predict in the future, but that combination of factors has never occurred in the past, you could put it in one of the clusters and say, it's going to behave like that one. Or maybe it's going to be 20% like that one, 30% like that one, 50% like another one. You can classify how you think the future behavior is going to be. Even if you've never run this particular promotion with that level of discount for this particular item in that particular market, you can still kind of predict what it's going to be. And you use that when you have no historical data, time series data, where a statistical or probabilistic forecast would be lost, because they're doing everything based on historical data. Now you say, okay, from seasonality, it's going to look like that one. For trends, going to look like that one. For its level, expected to be about this high, right? Use those as your prior distribution, and now start forecasting. And as demand starts coming in, you can use a Bayesian approach and tweak your distribution and improve it as you go forward. And then demand driven, I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. Forecast consumption, very quickly. If you have something that's order driven, it's precise in the area, the dark shaded area where all your orders are known. And then in the future, it knows nothing. Value is 0. That's what the blue line indicates. you're going to be purely forecast. You need to be purely forecast driven, but somewhere in the middle, some orders are known. You don't know how many you're still going to get. And the further away from today that you're going to get, the fewer orders are known. And you're going to be perfect in that area. You need a forecast there. Now, if you compare that to a forecast, you're going to have a not perfect value. You're going to be off no matter what, but it's going to degrade slowly over time. It's not suddenly going to drop down to zero. So what you can do is you can combine those two in a probabilistic sense. You can now say, I'm going to take the orders that I do have, use that information to improve my forecast in that gray area until I have no further information in the end. And if you think of that in terms of uncertainty, your uncertainty goes the full range for your orders when there's no more orders. But you can benefit from no uncertainty in the initial stage when you combine them, and then grow to the level of uncertainty when there's no more orders to be had. And it's premised on the fact that you can do a conditional forecast. How much do I expect forecast to be given that I've already received this many orders? My forecast was 100. We're 1 week in, we already got 80. Given that we are already at 80, what's the forecast going to be? Not just for this period, but maybe also it has an effect for some of the following periods. Metrics, really quickly. This is where everything goes wrong. And anyone that's read my blogs, you'll seen this picture. The difference between accuracy and precision. Accuracy is how close, how centered are you on the target, and precision is how close are your shots together, right? So in the ideal, you want to be accurate and precise. But if you had to give up one of the two, which one would you give up? And in the interest of time, I'll give you the answer, and that's accuracy. Accuracy is what you care about. Precision, not so much. Now, another way to look at that, if you take the dartboards away, ahead of time, you don't know what your accuracy is. You don't see the difference between left and right. Right? And when you're forecasting, you don't know yet where the target's going to be. So this is the state you're in. You don't know, but you do know your precision. So at time of forecasting, you know exactly what your precision is. You have no clue what your accuracy is. That you can only measure after the fact. Okay. Oh, there we go. So if we compare a statistical versus probabilistic metrics, on the left, you see a statistical forecast is given as a 1 point, and then we assume what the distribution is based on the residual error of the distribution of the residual error, whereas a probabilistic forecast will basically calculate what the whole distribution should be, and the thing that matters of that forecast is the median, not the mean. For normal distribution, they are the same, but generally, in a probabilistic perspective, you care way more about the median than the mean. I like to say the mean is meaningless. Now, if you look at the traditional metrics like bias and any kind of error, the bias is how far are you from the actual. So that's the left-right type error. And if you calculate some kind of mean absolute error, you're looking at a lot of measures, and then you're saying how far away were these errors. Well, we had 10 of where we're 1 away, 11 where we're 2 away, and so forth, and we're going to calculate an error. The probabilistic metric perspective is really separating accuracy and precision, where your precision is just based on your distribution. It knows nothing about the actual. That's why you can calculate it ahead of time. Just says what's my dispersion of my distribution, and the accuracy is basically after the fact. How, if I forecasted this distribution, how close to the real distribution was it? So the traditional perspective is my average. How far away was that from my average actual? The probabilistic version is how far away was my predicted distribution from the actual distribution? Right, so we're really comparing distribution to distribution rather than number to number. And then there's what I mentioned about the probabilistic one. Precision is known when forecasting. Unfortunately, its scale is unknown. accuracy, you can actually have a known skill. You can predict it or can project it on a 0 to 100% scale. How accurate are we? Are we 99%? Are we 99.9%? Right? But when we look at the traditional metrics, we got a problem in that the absolute error, it's neither on a known skill, nor do we know it ahead of time, right? Bias is pretty good, but the precision allows us to focus on reducing the noise when we're forecasting. The accuracy knows exactly how good we were, right? If we have a 17% MAPE, which is an accuracy metric, are we good? Are we bad? We don't know. Can we get to 16? We really don't know. This slide, by the way, is on Dropbox. Oh, the whole presentation is on Dropbox. I have a link on the last slide, so you can look at this at your leisure if you want what all the metrics are. And I will probably end up going deeper into that in the next session. So one last example, if you throw a couple of dice, and let's say you throw a dice once every month for 12 months, the statistical forecast says you'll throw a 7 every time, because that's the average that you can expect. And the probabilistic forecast will show you the odds of giving any number. That's really the difference between statistical and predictive. And then your error, if your dice are fair and you throw enough times, your error will be set 0%. Whereas if you look at the statistical one, you'll have an error of 37%. But the important realization is it's not really error. That's natural variation. You were unable to separate the natural variation from your true error. Because in this case, 7 is the correct average, but still your metrics are going to tell you 37%, right? That's where the metrics are wrong. We're putting the wrong metrics into the front of a forecasting cycle, and we just don't know how we can improve. One is precise, the other is accurate. Let's skip all over this. So the conclusion, final, George Box, very important guy in the forecasting arena was known for mentioning all models are wrong, but some are useful. And Einstein, my favorite scientist, said, as far as laws of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. But as far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality. I found this to be very true. It's been my email signature for at least 15 years. If you combine those two, reality is uncertain. As soon as your model assumes certainty, it's wrong. It's too wrong. It cannot be saved. In my book, it's fundamentally flawed. On the other hand, the uncertain models are difficult. So this is where you guys come in, because this is where we need to have research. This is where we need to improve and get better and creating scalable, foolproof models that embrace this uncertainty. Here's my contact information if you want to reach me, and the link at the bottom right, you can find the whole PowerPoint, including some of the slides I skipped over and the appendix slides near the back. Exactly on 4:30. We did have some questions throughout. I do have time if anyone else wants to ask more questions. I'm sorry, I had a little bit too many slides.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much for your presentation today, Stefan. I think, out of all the slides, some 3-4 slides are very, very helpful and useful to understand the conceptual thinking, and then how you put that, set the stage, where we start, what happened, and what are we going to do. That was fantastic. I mean, the group is open for questions. We'll have some quick questions for the next 5 minutes. Of course, Stefan is having the second session planned in the month of March. There will be flyers coming out. There he will detail more details about probabilistic forecasting, data-driven approaches. That will be more interesting to all our PhD and master students, especially in operations, research, and industrial engineering. Any questions from the audience? No questions? This is the golden opportunity. Yes.
Yeah,
go on.
I have one question. Hi, Stephen. I mean, as an employer, I mean, what do you look? I mean, if you want a forecaster or a person who does forecasting, and what do you look for this current? I mean, the probabilistic forecasting. What skills do you look? What all softwares or something like that? Can you throw some light on that?
Well, it depends on the role. So somewhere this year, I'm going to start looking for my backup, which is the person who will work with me on the algorithms. And that person will have very different requirements than if you're a software developer or if you're a consultant, right? So I believe wholeheartedly that software should enable the business. And if software is making it difficult, you got the wrong software. And that includes for the consultants, not just for the end user. So you should not need to understand statistics to be able to run the software, use the software. But it should be foolproof, right? That's really what I'm going for. You can liken it to a car. Right? In the old days, I could look under the hood, and if there's something wrong with my carburetor or a spark plug, I could figure it out. Nowadays, I have to go to the dealership, and their mechanics need to plug it in to figure out what's wrong with it. Right? So it's the same thing with enterprise solutions. You are going to see more black box, and as long as you can visualize in a way that explains why something happened or how bad it is, and people can track it down, what the root cause was, it doesn't really matter that they don't understand how the engine determined that, right? As long as it makes intuitive sense, or you can see the cause and the consequence, and you can connect the two. I'm more confident in what my car can do these days than I was in the car I drove in the early 90s. Even though I don't understand this one anymore, but I did understand that one. So, and that's the same thing. And it's already happening. There was a big fear of black boxes in the 90s and before. And now that fear has mostly gone down in the enterprise software space.
So in the interest of our students, one last question and then we will close it up. I mean, I'll add this question to what Ajit just asked. From master's and PhD students, typically with industrial engineering, operations, research background, if they are looking for some kind of analyst role, some kind of demand forecasting, that kind of a role in any organizations. Mm-hmm. So what skill sets they need to develop and how they need to equip themselves, perform them. Any tips for our students?
So yeah, well, it depends if you're, so the vast majority of jobs out there. Now, supply chain is a really good place to work in. It's a lot of fun. But 95% of the companies out there are still laggards. So if you're a person who just loves to work in statistics, you'll be fine in those companies. You'll be in the demand planning, department. If you're a data scientist, even the laggards are starting to look at artificial intelligence. There's a lot of stuff happening there. You can amuse yourself. But if you really want to move the needle, right? If you're interested in innovating, then there's very few companies in the industry that are really ahead of the curve. But in the software space and in the services space, more software and services, you'll find that there's companies out there that really want to make a difference. Wahupa being one of them. That's really my driving force, is to make a change. I see all this waste, all this inefficiency, all this instability, and I want to change that. But there's many companies, many startups and medium-sized companies like mine that have the same mindset. And they're just in different areas. I happen to do that on the probabilistic side. There's many of them on the artificial intelligence side. There's evolutionary computing, which is interesting. There are a couple of companies out there that I can see an application for. So depends on what your natural affinities are. If you're driven, go with a startup.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I think this is a great presentation. I hope the entire audience will accept with me. It was a good presentation about forecasting different types. We are looking forward for the next session. I mean, that's going to be more data driven. Like you said, it's going to be fire hose with a lot of bombs ready to be exploded.
Yes,
Thanks
so
a lot.
I'll go into some of the slides that I breezed over today.
Yeah.
I'll go
Yeah.
into them a little slower and more deeply, and I'll add some other stuff there. It'll probably be another firehouse though.
Thank you so much. Thanks, participants, for participating today. There are events lined up. Even tomorrow, we have one more session. Some of you must have already registered. So keep registering for the forthcoming events. I will see you later. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.